There's a conversation you've never had, an argument you won perfectly, a moment where you said exactly the right thing and everyone in the room understood you completely. It never happened, but your brain treated it like it almost did, and that's where things get interesting. A significant portion of people spend a meaningful amount of their waking hours inside scenarios that don't exist. Not daydreaming about vacations or career goals, something more specific than that. They're rehearsing confrontations. They're imagining being misunderstood and then brilliantly explaining themselves. They're constructing entire conversations with people who aren't in the room, sometimes people they'll never speak to again. And from the outside, this looks like either anxiety, avoidance, or a mild disconnection from reality. But the psychology underneath is considerably more layered than any of those explanations suggest. The common assumption is that people who live inside imagined scenarios are running away from something, that it's a form of escapism, a way to avoid the discomfort of real life by retreating into a version of it that feels more controllable. And there's a surface-level logic to that. If real conversations feel unpredictable, why not rehearse them endlessly in a space where you control every variable? If real outcomes feel uncertain, why not simulate the ones you want until they feel almost real? But that framing misses something important, because escapism implies passivity, lying back, letting pleasant images wash over you. What researchers have found is that this kind of imaginative simulation is often deeply active. The brain isn't resting, it's working. When a person constructs a fake scenario, particularly one involving social interaction, the regions of the brain associated with real social processing activate in remarkably similar ways to when the interaction is actually occurring. The prefrontal cortex, which handles planning, prediction, and social reasoning, engages. The amygdala, which processes emotional significance, responds. And critically, the brain's reward circuitry, including dopamine pathways, can fire during imagined outcomes, especially when those outcomes feel satisfying or resolved. In other words, the brain doesn't always cleanly distinguish between imagining something and experiencing it. The emotional weight registers either way. This is why people who frequently imagine fake scenarios often report that it feels productive, even when nothing external has changed. They've processed something internally. They've reached a resolution, however fictional, and the neurological reward for that resolution is real, even if the scenario wasn't. A 2019 study examining mental simulation found that people who regularly engage in detailed imagined social scenarios showed stronger activation in the default mode network, the brain system most active during self-referential thinking, social cognition, and future planning. This network isn't a sign of dysfunction. It's associated with some of the more sophisticated cognitive capacities humans possess: empathy, narrative construction, understanding other minds. The people running imaginary conversations aren't disengaged from reality. In many cases, they're practicing one of the most socially complex cognitive skills that exists: modeling other people's perspectives and responses. That doesn't make the behavior without cost. It simply suggests the cost isn't located where most people assume it is. Where things become genuinely complicated is when you examine what kinds of scenarios people tend to imagine. Research on spontaneous thought, the mind's unprompted wandering, consistently shows a pattern. People are far more likely to simulate negative or unresolved social scenarios than positive ones. The conversation that went badly, the moment they felt dismissed, the thing they should have said. This isn't random. The brain has what's sometimes called a negativity bias, a deeply embedded tendency to attend more carefully to potential threats and unresolved conflicts than to settled positive experiences. From an evolutionary standpoint, this made sense. An unresolved social conflict, being misunderstood, rejected, or underestimated by your group, carried real consequences. Replaying it, analyzing it, preparing for it again was adaptive. The problem is that this system wasn't designed for a world where social interactions are constant, varied, and often ambiguous. So people find themselves rehearsing arguments with coworkers at 2 in the morning, running through what they'd say if a certain conversation happened, constructing entire exchanges with people who may never know those conversations took place. The mechanism is ancient, the context it's operating in is entirely modern. Here's the insight that often reframes this behavior in an unexpected way. The scenarios people imagine most obsessively tend to be the ones where they were not fully understood. Not necessarily the ones where something painful happened, but specifically the ones where they felt their actual meaning, intention, or identity didn't come across. There's something revealing in that. It suggests that this kind of mental simulation is, at its core, a search for accurate representation. The brain keeps returning to those moments not simply out of anxiety, but because something feels incomplete. The person's internal model of themselves, who they are, what they meant, what they're actually like, didn't match how they were received. And the mind keeps trying to close that gap, even in the absence of any real-world opportunity to do so. This connects to something psychologists call the need for cognitive closure, the drive to reach a clear understanding of ambiguous situations. People differ in how strongly they feel this need. Those who feel it more intensely are more likely to replay ambiguous or unresolved interactions, searching for the interpretation that finally makes complete sense. It's less about insecurity and more about a particular relationship with uncertainty. Some minds are comfortable leaving experiences open-ended, others aren't. Neither disposition is a flaw. They simply represent different ways of processing a world that is, by nature, full of social ambiguity. What this also reveals is something about how identity functions. A person's sense of self isn't a fixed, static thing. It's maintained actively, in constant negotiation with the social environment. Every interaction either confirms or slightly challenges how a person understands themselves. When an interaction does challenge that self-understanding, when someone misreads your intentions, or when you didn't express yourself the way you meant to, the mind doesn't simply move on. It reopens the file. It tries again. The imagined scenario isn't just an escape. In a very real sense, it's a rehearsal of self. This doesn't mean that all imagined scenario building is healthy, or that it can't become its own trap. When simulation replaces engagement, when a person consistently chooses the imaginary version of a conversation over the actual one, the gap between internal experience and external life can quietly widen. The brain keeps getting rewarded for resolutions it constructed itself in a controlled space with no actual feedback from another person. Over time, real interactions can start to feel more threatening by comparison, simply because they're unpredictable in ways the imagined ones aren't. That's the genuine risk. Not that the behavior is strange, but that it can become self-reinforcing in ways the person doesn't notice. And yet, there's something that deserves acknowledgement here. The capacity to run detailed mental simulations of social scenarios is not separate from the capacity to understand people deeply. Empathy, at a neurological level, requires imagining the internal states of others, their reasoning, their emotional responses, their perspective. The same cognitive machinery, the same default mode network. People who spend significant time inside imagined conversations are often, somewhat paradoxically, the people who are most invested in being understood and in understanding others accurately. The behavior that looks like withdrawal is sometimes the clearest sign of how much connection matters to them. What the psychology of imagined scenarios ultimately reveals isn't dysfunction. It's a portrait of minds that take social reality seriously, perhaps too seriously to leave it to chance. Minds that rehearse, refine, and return to moments of incomplete communication because being understood, to them, isn't incidental, it's foundational. If you recognize something of yourself in this, you probably also think carefully about why people behave the way they do, not just what they do. That kind of thinking has its own psychology, and if you want to understand it further, you'll likely find the next video on how overthinking shapes perception worth your time.